Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to this webinar that we're running in conjunction with our good friends at Working In about the pending changes or likely changes as a result to the immigration settings that will be kicking in July. And so it's a good idea, we think, to get ahead of any potential challenges. So I'd like to introduce you to Scott and Nazim, and I'll let you guys work out which one is which, and then they can take it away. I'll be monitoring the Q&A, so if you've got a question that you want answered, just bang it into the Q&A session. And then what we'll do is we'll just get underway. So I'll hand over now to Scott and Nazim.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. As James said, my name is Scott Matheson, and I'm the co-founder of Working In. For those that don't know, we've been in the business for about 25 years, helping New Zealand employers not just find skilled people from offshore, but helping them with all matters of their immigration visas, and specifically to help you retain your migrant workforce or those on visas. I have with me my head of immigration, which is Nazim. So if I could pass you over to Nazim to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm not Scott, I'm Nazim, as you probably guessed. So I'm a licensed immigration advisor and I've been with Working In for 13 years. And so over that time, we've done, just at the numbers, tens of thousands of visas. So I've been helping New Zealand employers for quite a while. And we're going to go through a little bit of detail today about how you guys can retain your migrant talent.
Fantastic, thank you. Exactly right. So look, it is an interesting time because there are a lot of changes coming with immigration, and there is the potential for those that are not prepared to lose staff en masse. Recently, we were talking to a transportation operator who had 30 people on visas, and they were all expiring in August, September, and they were unaware that that meant that those workers had to do a mandatory 12-month stand down, i.e. leave New Zealand, and they were facing the prospect of all 30 drivers having to, step down and 30 trucks essentially being unmanned. So, these problems are resolvable, and today is really about making sure that you are aware of what is happening so that you can act on it. And that's why we're here today working with James to ensure that you're aware. That's the number one. I guess the background is we have we did up until, in post-COVID, a massive shortage of drivers. I think that when the doors opened under the previous government, a lot of drivers came through. There was a slowdown clearly in the amount of drivers needed, but what we're starting to see is an uptick. I appreciate that all you want to deal with is the day-to-day, but the reality is, and I'm just looking at my notes here, that it's predicted that the shortage of drivers could grow up to 18,000 in the next 5 years. Globally, the truck driver shortage is expected to double from 3 million to 7 million unfilled roles. That's from the International Road Transport Union. And in New Zealand, a lot of the causes are the aging population, the baby boomers are leaving the workforce. We have fewer young people entering the industry, and i.e. 12% of all drivers are under the age of 25, only a small percentage of women in the industry. And I guess there's a lot of cost associated with training and licensing and insurance to become a truck driver. So we are in a backdrop where the immigration settings have changed. Today, we're going to be talking about, and Nazim will be doing most of the talking, so this is my introduction. One, accreditation. So either you have it or you don't. And if you do have it, then from July 4 onwards, those accreditations will be coming up for renewal. If you haven't lodged your renewal before the time that your accreditation expires, then you're putting yourself at significant risk. Your tokens will evaporate immediately, and the time between your accreditation and your accreditation renewal, that lapsed time will mean that you cannot hire or renew the visas. So there's a bit of a risk there. We'll be talking about ways that you can retain your workforce. There's two key ways. One is through the visa extension, which was announced in November last year, and the other one is through residency. So we have a lot of ways that we can help you implement ideas to, I guess, engage your drivers and ensure that they remain with you. We are now seeing a situation where the sector agreement was for Class 4 and Class 5 drivers only. They are the ones that have a residency from work pathway, which means in 2 years they can potentially apply for residency. And the impact is that a lot of Class 2 drivers that are on visas are going, well, hang on, what about me? I want residency, so I'm going to be a Class 4 driver, and they are leaving companies that don't offer that. So there's a few things to talk about. I think I'll just go straight to Nazim first, though, and let's just discuss accreditation. What is it? We'll start at the beginning, just for those people that don't know, and then we'll work through the whole process of what to do now. So Nazim, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. So I just want to check, can everyone see the screen with the information about the 4 different types of the 4 processes of the AWV?
Yes,
Perfect.
that's
Excellent.
coming through.
So as Scott said, just a little bit of background, because I think it's important to understand, or just to refresh our memories as to how the process works and why some of the changes that have come in do or don't affect different employers and their workers. So as we know, we moved to this AEWV, which is the employer-led process. So that means that there is normally 3 stages, but you'll see that there's a 4th thing listed on the screen. So obviously accreditation is the #1 first step that every employer needs to start with. If you aren't accredited, you are not able to access that offshore talent. So you'll note that I've listed that accreditation is valid for 12 months and then 2 years on the renewal. That's because that's what the policy says. If you already held accreditation and you applied for it at the right time, you might have automatically had it extended for a further year, but that's not within the instructions. It was great that some employers did quickly get onto that, but anyone applying from this point on will only get the 12 months and then the 2 years on renewal. So the accreditation helps the government feel confident that you're a good company, you've got the right systems in place, and you should be allowed to access this international talent pool. The next step after that is called the job check. So a job check is required for every occupation. You need to provide labour market testing. In your industry, you have to. There isn't any ways around it unless there's some drivers out on like $150 an hour, which I don't think is the case. So you do need to advertise and you need to prove that there is nobody available locally in the market to do the role that you've got. On approval, you can get tokens, and then these tokens can be used once each for a different person, and they're only valid for 6 months, so a maximum of 6 months on these tokens. So the blue side is the employer-led process. So these are the parts of the process that the employer not only has to lead, but you have to cover all the costs associated with it. These can't be passed on to the individual. On the other side, we've got in the green, the AEWV. So this is step 3. This is where the individual actually applies for the visa. So you can see that there's a lot that you have to do as an employer first in order for someone to be able to apply for a visa. Now, this person, when they go to apply for the visa, they're going to take the job check token that you've shared with them, and they can currently apply for a visa for up to 5 years, depending on the role, the pay rate, and whether or not there's a stand down period that applies when they apply. Some occupations are eligible for residency, but not all, as Scott alluded to earlier. And the 4th thing that I've noted on the page is the job change. So the job change is where an individual is moving between companies, or they're within the same company and they're changing roles. So it's like a change of work conditions. So the employer, the role, the location, one of those things, they require a job change. Now, if they're changing, they do require a new job check token. And then what they'll get is the balance of the existing visa in some instances. Or if they don't qualify that, they actually have to go back into a whole new AEWV. It's a little bit technical detail there. We can always go through that on a case-by-case basis. You might not as I've noted here, you might not be able to get a job change if the individual's paid below the median wage. And that's to do with the fact that there might be a stand down period or there's a limitation in the instructions as to how much longer they can stay in the country. So I think just as a summary, it's good to understand what we're working with, the system that we're working within at the moment. So firstly, on accreditation renewal, this is the most important thing that you should be thinking of, because this is the basis of everything else that you can do for your business and for your employees. Now, you need to maintain accreditation if you want to hire a new migrant from offshore, have an onshore migrant change their visa over to you, have any of your existing staff qualify for residency. So once upon a time, you'd offer somebody a job, they'd apply for residency off their own back and it didn't matter. The new changes mean, regardless of how people are applying for their skilled residency, the employer must be accredited, and you need to maintain that accreditation up until their visa is approved. So you're going to have to meet the accreditation policy requirements for the new application or even the renewal. So you actually need to maintain the eligibility while you hold it as well. But these are generally the two main times that immigration is looking at it. Now, we recommend that you review all of your visa holders, not just those on an AEWV, and their conditions to make sure that there is compliance. So very often we find that unknowingly employers have hired people on what they thought was an open work visa, or that didn't have any conditions, or they were aware of the conditions when they first started, but then due to business change needs, they've had the person move into another role and they haven't necessarily changed the visa to match. So what that's meant is that on the renewal process, some of this has come to light and it needs to be addressed before you can get your accreditation reapproved. That's ideally when it's highlighted. You don't want it picked up by Immigration New Zealand first, because that causes more problems for you in terms of dealing with it. And it's also recommended that as part of your renewal process, you do a full review of your settlement obligations that are required under the AEWV. Now, if at any time I'm going too fast or you've got any questions, as James has noted, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A, or I'm sure Scott might jump in because I know he thinks like an employer does.
Well, I do. So I asked questions that, you know, this is complex, Nazim. And I think the complexity is because we've got the renewal coming up. So for the viewers, it's almost 2 years ago since Immigration New Zealand opened the accreditation application process, May 2022. And the first accreditations were granted in July 2022. Originally, they were meant to be for 1 year, and then the government was quite overwhelmed, so they extended it to 2 years. So what Nazim is talking about, Nazim, is that from the July or the 4th onwards, these accreditation renewals are going to be taking place, and anyone who's listening should be looking at all your workers that you've employed and ensuring that they're on the correct pay rate and location in line with their visa, but also the settlement requirements. And I think a lot of employers have kind of in haste missed some of this detail. Can you just drill down a little bit, because it is something that is quite pedantic, but also immigration really want to see employers undertaking that part of the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key settlement obligations is that new staff members on an AEWV are going through those employment modules. So not just yourselves that are in the head office that might be sitting behind a desk and, you know, do this as part of your day-to-day, but the new employees are required to have had the opportunity and to do this within the first month of them starting with you. So that's the number one thing that we're seeing is not being addressed. And it's the number one thing that Immigration New Zealand seems to be asking about, because it's in their minds, it's an easy way to catch you on whether or not you follow the process or not. So you've either got evidence that they've done the modules or you don't. So that's the number one thing that we're finding is not being met in terms of those settlement obligations. And I think it was a new thing most businesses are very, very busy. We know your industry in particular, you know, it's hard to carve out time to sometimes do some of these things that are outside of the norm. And so as part of any process, I appreciate that it is hard to try to like carve time out to do it. But the sooner you start the process and the sooner you're reviewing these things, the sooner you can start correcting anything that's missing from the process and putting in some new systems and processes to make it easier for yourselves moving forward.
Now,
Thank
we
you.
do have a question, which is probably quite pertinent. So what happens to the immigrants that are employed if your accreditation is not renewed?
So if you're not renewing your accreditation, the visa that they hold remains. They just can't renew it once it expires. So if you know that, you know, your accreditation's expired on the 4th of July and they've got a visa until, I don't know, the 12th of December, you know that 12th of December, because you don't have accreditation anymore, that individual is no longer able to be employed by you. So
they will either need to move to an employer that is accredited or exit New Zealand.
Correct. And what you'll probably find in that 6 months is that because of the levels of stress around that person, while they're looking to do those things, they're not going to be an optimal employee either. And you might have issues with health and safety.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answered that question. We can move on to the next slide. Oh, hang on. How long does it take for accreditation renewals to be approved? That varies. That varies on the employer, your history with Immigration New Zealand, and what evidence you've already got. So like all things, the better prepared you are, the faster things move. If you already know that there's a problem with your systems or some of the day-to-day application of the policy, if you can correct that and you can provide that evidence that it's been corrected, obviously then the accreditation process is going to move faster. I have seen instances where Immigration New Zealand has just randomly decided to pop in on an employer prior to them they're working on their accreditation, but they haven't submitted it, and they're getting questions on things that they can't answer. And so then the back and forth in some instances is adding weeks or even months. And so the better prepared you are, the easier it is for the officials to tick the boxes, the faster everything's going to move forward. So I guess it's like anything else in business. The better prepared you are, the more evidence you've got sort of filed in a nice way to substantiate the requirements, the faster things move.
So Nazim, just to give you a little bit of a break there. Go on, James, sorry.
Yeah, we have another question too that's popped up. Are the settlement requirements needed if the employee already has a visa and we are going through the job change process?
So I realised that I suddenly can't remember off the top of my head that exact point. Now, if it's their first AEWV over to you, because they've gone from essential skills to AEWV, then absolutely, they do require it. I'm going to have to ask, I will have to come back to everybody because I remember the team were arguing about it, and unfortunately I checked out when they got to the answer as to whether or not they need to do it with every employer. But I will confirm and I will come back. But absolutely, the very first AEWV. What we actually recommend, even if it's not required, is that it's best practice that as soon as somebody starts with you, you go through that process again, because if you're not, you're likely to miss the people that you should have done it with. Because how are you going to know that the last employer did it and that you're actually covered? Are you getting evidence of this from the previous employer? It's highly unlikely. So best practice would be that your induction process is they start on day one, they do a tour of the yard, they fill out their paperwork, they meet their manager, they sit down at a desk, and they spend half an hour doing the modules, and then it's ticked off and you don't have to worry about it anymore. So that would be my personal advice, but I will double check the immigration instructions and I'll feed that back to the whole of the association membership.
Yep, good.
Cool.
All right, so just Nazim, I was gonna, is there another question?
No, it's just those ones.
So when we started, we just talked about the visa extensions, and just to give you a bit of a break there, Nazim, from the 27th of November, any new visas being issued under the AEWV were 5 years in most instances. Prior to that, and under the sector agreement, they were either 2 or 3 years. And so when we talk about being able to retain your workers for longer, there is the opportunity to extend their visas for those that are on a 2 or 3 year visas beyond that. And we're working with a lot of employers at the moment that are working with their drivers mainly to extend their visas. In almost every instance, they want to do that. They want to stay in New Zealand as long as they possibly can, especially if they don't have a residency pathway. So we think that's a really good solution, especially as the market's starting to tick up, that you can actually use this as an opportunity to, create value to your employee and bridge the gap between you both and ensure that they can stay a bit longer. So Nazim, do you just want to go into the detail around that and how that all works?
Yep, and we have one more question that I think is associated to this slide, which is, does the new minimum wage apply to Class 5 drivers?
Yeah, so it does actually tie in. So it's important to understand that for the AEWV, you've currently got one wage threshold. And then for the residency piece, you have a different wage threshold. So if you're hiring somebody on an AEWV today, the minimum wage that you need to be offering them under the AEWV is only the $29.66. But when they're applying for their residency, they need to be at whatever the median wage is for residency at that time. So at the moment, so if you're applying for your residency today because you've got the required work experience as a Class 4 or 5 driver, you need to be on $31.61 for the residency to be approved, as well as obviously the right license. But if you're just hiring somebody and you're just offering them like a new role and you want them to come and work for you on an AEWV, you currently only need to offer $29.66. So appreciate that that's not super clear because the government's decided to put different thresholds at different places along the way. And there's a table that we'll come to at the very end that'll show you what people need to be on what date in order to qualify for that residency piece. But all of that also highlights that it's the complexity of it and why it's important to get any employee that's a migrant the longest possible visa whenever you can, whenever the opportunity has been presented to you at a rate that you know what it is right now. So we didn't know in advance last year that the government wasn't going to apply the $31.61 to the AEWV. They've also just said that it's a pause in relation to the AEWV, but they decided it was important to apply it to residents. So, there is an expectation that they could lift that pause because it helps in some instances slow the reliance on the policy. And I think, politically, sometimes that looks good. It doesn't necessarily help business. And so you need to be thinking of that when you're doing your workforce planning and you're looking at all of your staff and you're saying, well, this driver's been with us for 2 years or he's got a visa for 3 years. Do I get him the balance now or do I worry about it down the line when maybe I need to pay him $35 base an hour? But it also means that you can calculate your minimum costs and control them a little bit sooner. But it also gives the migrant the security that they know that they don't have to worry about it for a lot longer. So the example before where if their visa is expiring in 6 months and you're not accredited, that work is not going to be great. That's going to affect your business. And then there's the other sort of costs that it costs your business other than just their hourly rate. So yeah, the key is you absolutely need to get your accreditation renewed so that people can apply for the balance as soon as possible. And if you're not already doing this now, I would recommend that you put some time aside and we talk about how you can do that to ensure that you're basically future-proofing your business.
And Nazim, on that note, we think it's really important to communicate with your people as early as possible around your plans, because if there's another employer who's willing to offer the pathway to residency or 5-year visa, you need to make sure that they understand that that's what you're also going to be doing before they start looking around. And so open communication right from the get-go around your plans is imperative.
Absolutely, the communication is key.
Yeah, especially if those plans are you want to hang on to that person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't want them, that's different.
I'm assuming that, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but we do see that, Scott. You get that a lot of the times. You go, why did that driver, take this opportunity somewhere else? They're not, we're not, they're one of my best drivers. Did you ever tell them that? Because if you didn't tell them that, how do they know? Yeah.
I guess people just like to feel loved and looked after, whatever that looks like, even if it's just to know that you care enough that you've joined this webinar, you've gone through the detail and you understand how it is that you can support them moving forward.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh yeah, so just that final point there, that the extensions require that you maintain your accreditation. So that's why that accreditation piece is so important. It actually is the basis of everything else. It's literally the foundation of being able to secure your workforce. So let's go to the next slide. So just a summary of some of the other changes. So obviously the pay rates and what that looks like and how it affects is top of mind, but some other changes just to be aware of is obviously the Worker Protection Act that's come in, the 90-day trials. There was some emails that went out to some employer databases that said, yep, you can bring back 90-day trials, and some employers implemented it, even though you can't under the AEWV. That's the only time you can't. Everybody else, doesn't matter. But if they're on an AEWV work visa, you cannot implement the 90-day trial. If you're hiring someone who's on an open work visa, like a working holiday or something else, totally fine, but not in the AEWV space. And obviously the last thing is that there's just more stringent rules with regards to employers hiring migrants. And this is a direct response to some of the migrant exploitation stuff we've seen in the media. So MB's saying, when we ask for something, we want it straight away. So that whole preparation piece becomes really important. And they've doubled down on the fact that if you've had breaches of employment or immigration instructions in law, that they can use that to have your accreditation revoked, suspended, cancelling your job checks, tokens, all of that kind of stuff. And we've already seen evidence of that with the number of accreditations that have been cancelled, further ones being refused, and then tokens and those employers suddenly disappearing from I guess the whole, the industry and that whole space. So it is important. I mean, these aren't bad things. These are good things that the government's implementing, and it's to stop the unscrupulous operators within certain industries and to help protect migrants and ultimately the reputation of New Zealand as a destination to come and work at. So specifically on the extensions and renewals, it's important to understand that when they're applying for the extension, they're applying for the balance that they're able to get based on the visa that they had approved, and that's tied to whether they were at or below the median wage. So depending on when you applied, if your first visa was applied when the median wage was $25 an hour, the balance you'll be able to get is 2 years. If you applied when the median wage was, say, $27.76, but there was an exemption for some reason and you were paid less, then the balance you'd only be able to get would be the extra 1 year to a maximum of 3. So it's important to understand who can do what. Don't just assume based on their current pay rate that what their balance will look like. It's important to understand exactly so that you're not leading the individual astray as to what their future options may or may not be. It's also important to understand that when they're applying for that balance or that extension piece, they do need to meet the health and character requirements. And it effectively is a whole new visa. This is just like a gift that the government's given to say, we're going to let you apply for a little bit more without the employer having to go through that labour market testing requirement again or having to increase your pay rate. So the reason why you would want to do the extension is that you're not having to pay somebody more necessarily in order to get that balance, and that might not ever come again. So it's really, really important to understand why this is such an opportunity and why you should be helping and encouraging all of your staff to move forward with getting the balance so they can stay with you for as long as possible at whatever rate they were originally offered. Now, where an individual was below the median wage, as I noted, they can get that extra year. Sometimes it makes sense because of how the market's moved and what they're getting paid now anyway, to actually get them to apply for a whole new AEWV. So if you're going to have to pay $750 government application fee anyway. Rather than getting the extra year, in those instances, you can get an extra 3. And so that's why it becomes quite important to understand the individual, what their residency pathway is, how that fits into your larger, I guess, business plans and workforce planning as to what's going to work out best for everybody. And in general, getting the maximum of that 5 years now is going to be the way to do it. Now, you guys are super lucky. Your association did all the hard yards on your behalf to make sure that you had a specific sector agreement. They got in there and they fought for you guys to have a pathway. So truck drivers in particular have always been a huge need in New Zealand. And it was only when employers would get accredited under the old talent instructions that we could get people residency. They scrapped that, and then we had like a lull where people couldn't qualify to stay in New Zealand as residents. So the sector agreement that's come through is really, really helpful, because it again gives you and your migrant staff a pathway to residency and that security with regards to your workforce. So the roles that are covered are all listed on the screen. Obviously, you're not particularly worried about ship's masters and deckhands. They do still fall under that auspice. But specifically, truck drivers, refuelers, furniture removalists, tanker drivers, tow truck drivers, these are all roles that have been specifically and explicitly listed as those that are eligible under the sector agreement to qualify for residency after the minimum 2-year work experience period in New Zealand. So the individual needs to be, the sector agreement requirements as well as like the general residency requirements as well in order to qualify. See, there's another question.
Yeah, so the question is, when will Class 2 drivers get pathway to residency? And I can pretty well answer that. They won't. So there's still a lot of opposition to any truck driver getting pathway to residency from some parts of the wider population, especially the unions. And so what we compromised with the minister at the time was the putting the limit in at Class 4 and Class 5. Now, the only exception to that is the bus drivers, because bus drivers can come in under their sector agreement on a Class 2 licence. So they still have a pathway to residency under Class 2. Now, in the fullness of time, we are still nibbling away at it, but I would not hold out too many candles of hope that that's going to happen anytime soon, especially while the economy is in recession. So as the economy recovers, and we all hope that's going to be soon rather than later, but as the economy recovers and the labour market tightens back up, then yes, we will be re-engaging the government in that conversation. Okay.
Looks like there's another one. Where would I get a copy of the agreement? Have you been able to send that out to your membership already?
Yeah, so that's the sector agreement, copy of the sector agreement. Yeah, we can send that out. That's and it's a very, very simple, it literally is less than 1 page.
Yeah, it's just a little sheet.
Yeah. Yeah.
The immigration policy is a few more pages. We could always send that, but you might cry trying to read through it. So I won't send through legislation.
Yeah, but the sector agreement's very simple.
So with your industry's pathway to residency, the general requirements, and this is at the time of applying for residence, the applicants must be aged 55 or under. So it's not the age that they got their work visa, it's the age they are when they qualify and apply for the residency piece. They must meet the health and character, and they must meet the English language ability. So this is something that didn't exist under the old talent instructions, but it applied to the other residency instructions, and is something that employers and applicants really, really need to be focusing on. So with regards to the employment piece, the drivers must be earning at least the median wage over the previous 24 months before applying for residence. And I'll show you that table that I referred to where you can calculate based on when they started, what they need to be earning and the rest of it. And they need to be in a role that primarily requires them to drive a vehicle that is a class 4 or 5. So as Scott mentioned, that will be why you might have people who are only in class 2 roles now that will be looking to move into a role that is class 4 or 5 so that they can qualify for residency after working for a couple of years. And importantly, they only need to have that class 4 or 5 license at time of application. We do know that obviously when you first come into New Zealand, you're able to drive on your overseas equivalent for 12 months. Obviously, best practice is to get people to upgrade their license to the New Zealand one as soon as possible, but they don't need to have done all of their work experience in New Zealand on a New Zealand class 4 or 5. It's just at the time of application for the residency. Now, I've got a whole separate slide for the English language requirement because this seems to be the one that's the most important at the moment. It's important to understand that there is no way that this is going to be waived. I think the current government, and I actually think rightly so, has a requirement for people to have a minimum standard of English. It helps with their settlement outcomes, helps with health and safety, and it is the most commonly spoken language still in New Zealand, so everyone should be able to speak it to a certain minimum standard. So you need to have either an IELTS score of 6.5 across on average, or if you're doing a PTE of 58, unless you're exempt. So the types of people who would be exempt are those that hold passports from countries like Canada, the UK, Ireland, Canada, Australia, if there's any more of us here. So that's when you would be exempt, but you literally can only get that exemption with a passport. You can't rely on work experience or anything else. You will need an English language test with the required score to meet this requirement.
So
this is for the principal applicant.
Can I just ask you, can you just explain what IELTS and PTE are?
So these are different approved English language testing systems. So Australia uses the exact same English language testing systems in order to determine that you have the required level of English. So IELTS stands for International English Language Testing System. PTE is the acronym for Pearson's, oh my gosh, testing.
Yeah, English.
English test, yeah, Pearson's testing of English. So these are just the types of English language tests that individuals can do to meet the criteria if they don't have the right passport. And it's important to understand that the English requirement must be met by the principal applicant. You can't get around it. If somebody has a family member that doesn't speak English, you can buy your way out of that requirement, but it's quite expensive. And it's per family member. So that's why it's really, really important that your workers who don't have passports from those exempt countries are working towards the right English language score so that bang on that 2-year requirement, they can apply for their residency as soon as possible. And it's not just good for them, it's obviously going to be good for yourselves as well. Now, we've been working with PTE in particular because we find that it's easier to get the kind of score that you would require, and it's more closely aligned to the type of English that we would be speaking on a day-to-day basis in New Zealand and in our workplaces. IELTS is a little bit more formal. Sometimes it feels weird because it doesn't feel natural to the way that we communicate in New Zealand. So the process that we've got is to take the individual through a learning journey to get them to the right required score so that they qualify for residency, but also so that they're going to be more confident communicating at work, and there's going to be less, I guess, misunderstandings, which can sometimes happen when there's a slight language barrier. I know I moved from Australia and people didn't always understand what I meant and vice versa. So you do have to get used to the local, I guess, accent and the colloquial terms that we might use here. So the way that we've got this system set up is that we can do an initial test to basically benchmark people and see where they're at without them having to do the full test at the full cost. And that will then help you and your workers work out, well, how much time do I need to commit to my English language over the next 6 months, 18 months, 24 months to get to the right level so that I do qualify for getting the right score and I can qualify for residency.
Okay, so this would be another example of something that the sooner you get a handle on this as an employer, the more options you're going to have to resolve whatever challenges may present themselves, correct? Don't leave it till when they're applying for residency.
I think it's also important to understand that if someone's been working for you, because they were part of that first cohort that arrived in sort of 2022, they're sort of coming up to their 24 months already.
Yeah.
And so they've only got like 12 months left. And are they going to be able to get to that right level or not? And if not, have you extended their visa to try to get the 2-year balance? So you're buying more time for them to get to the right level without having to increase wages and do all of this other stuff. And that's why it all really ties in together. And it's really important to understand who your workforce is and what that looks like, not just today, but what it looks like over 6, 12, 18 and 24 months, and what you should be doing to minimize your overall costs. Because we know that replacing someone isn't just the cost of their salary on average, even for roles that are sort of like your everyday role and not senior executive level, it costs, their salary plus 80%. So it's really, really high because of that whole recruitment piece. And so how do you make sure that you're getting the most out of your existing workforce without having to spend a lot more money if you had to, God forbid, replace them? So
James, I think in terms of this English requirement and the residency, different transportation companies are looking at it in different ways. But once the worker, for example, has done their initial test, and let's say for PTE they're on 40 and they need another 18 points to get to 58, and I'll just use an example of one company. They've said, well, you the worker, you go and get your English up to 58, and we can provide various options around that. We've got our own school, in fact. But secondly, once you get to that point, we will contribute towards your residency application. But it's not going to be for 2 years, let's say, but it's a way that you can actually hang an incentive out there. Well, you study your English, and all other things being equal, character, you can't have any drunk driving or anything like that, then we will, support you on that residency application. So there's lots of different ways that you can cut it, depending on how you want to incentivize them. But that one is being used and it's working really nicely.
Yep.
Nazim, back to you.
All right, so looking at, sorry, it's a little bit blurry. I've just realized this table. So this is the median wage. This was the table I referred to as to what applies for the transport sector when they're looking to apply for their residency over time. So you can see that the median wage has been increasing quite regularly. I think I did some numbers from even before July 2021. These numbers specifically relate to the transport sector eligibility, but just a median wage in general. And our median wage has been increasing at what feels like an alarming rate over such a short period of time. So when you see the numbers like this and you see that, oh, well, in less than 3 years, I'm having to pay almost $5 an hour more as a minimum in order to support someone for a visa, you can see how that can quite quickly become quite expensive if you're having to continually bring in a new person at a new base rate because you didn't extend the visa of the previous or the existing staff. So what you'd have to look at here is to see what is the date that they had that they lodged their visa, not necessarily when it was approved, as to what their minimum earning needs to be over that 2-year period, and where they need to be tracking in terms of when they go to apply for the residency piece. So we know if they were to apply today, they need to be on 3161. And we anticipate that that's going to continue to increase because the government likes indexing things to the median wage. So by being aware of it, you can plan around it, and you can see, it's easy to do the numbers and compare what it would cost if you didn't move people, get the maximum of visas now versus if you were to start at the very beginning with a new visa and what that cost difference would be over a 2-year period. And that's assuming people get their residency the day that they apply for residency. We know that those things take time, so there's going to be that lag as well in terms of moving from one policy to the other.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that I think that we are going to see continual increases in the median wage, because even though the economy has slowed, some would say dramatically, the labour market itself hasn't loosened much. You've only had a 1% lift in unemployment. So that tells us, in the conversation we've been having with MSD, that the labour market is still very, very tight. There is still a latent demand for especially for good workers. So, you're going to see continual pressure on wages, which will lift, that median wage is going to continue to lift.
So just a summary of tools for not just the retention, but also the attraction, because although you might not feel that you need extra staff now, we do see that that's going to change around the corner. Scott shared some stats as to what's happening worldwide. We know that some countries that traditionally didn't need as much staff because they had huge populations are seeing population declines, and they're aggressively looking to recruit from overseas, China being our favourite, which is incredible because you would never think about the Chinese government doing active recruitment offshore of workers to come to fill skills shortage needs. So it's important to be thinking not just about keeping, but what you're doing to be able to attract anybody else that you might need to fill any gaps. So really the workforce planning is the best thing to start with. It's the preparation. Have you got your accreditation renewal sorted? Are you looking at that in terms of also who you need to extend, who you need to move on to a different visa? How else can you be supporting those individuals to make sure that they're getting their maximum visa eligibility entitlement now? Doing the labour market testing checks, getting your job check while you have your accreditation, and just aligned again with the job checks and accreditations. When your accreditation expires, or any leftover tokens also then disappear, they're no longer valid. So that's why keeping your accreditation up to date is always so important. When you're looking at sourcing and the visa applications, what is your local plan? What's your international plan? Are you set up to ensure that you basically have access to everybody in the world? Understanding the minimum that you must pay under policy versus what might be an attractive market rate. That might be particularly relevant if you're trying to coax someone to come and work for you who's already onshore. Sometimes it's easier than not, depending on what the previous employer is or isn't offering in terms of support towards residency and what you can offer. And then looking at options outside of the AEWB pathway. So could you work with a company that can provide you with contracting workers? Is there people, it's not ideal, but sometimes there's also people on working holidays that might join your team, but they are sort of limited in how long they can stay with you. That's not always ideal, especially when you want an ongoing, reliable workforce. And then looking at your retention. What's your progression and development plan for those existing staff? Are you helping them with their English? Are you helping them work towards their residency by supporting them with the right class of license, moving them maybe into a role and changing their visa for a role that does have a pathway to residency? Are you helping those individuals to bring their family members where they have them to come to New Zealand? Because we know that helps with settlement outcomes, and it keeps people more rooted in that local community and with that employer, so that everyone just wins. Do you have bonus schemes, incentives, anything else that you can use to try to keep people or bring over their friends who have the same sort of skill and attitude to your business? And I think it's also super important that you're keeping on top of all the immigration changes and understanding when they do or don't affect you and your workforce. So every time there's a change announced, we do notice that the migrants are quite active on social media. They're posting on and asking questions of us on our Facebook pages saying, does this affect me? I heard my friend did X or Y. What does my employer need to do? You need to know what everyone else is discussing so that you can be prepared to deal with it and say, we've already got a plan, or you don't have to worry because it doesn't affect us because of X or Y reason. It just gives, I guess, peace of mind to your workers that you have it under control and you've got the support that you need because you're working with a licensed immigration advisor or whoever it is, that everything is going to be taken care of and they just need to focus on their job because it's the plan. So I think that's actually quite important, because otherwise you can get overwhelmed with the noise. So those are my
I think
personal
that last
tips.
point's very important, because this industry, thrives on, shall we say, rumour, speculation, all that sort of stuff, and drivers, that chatter. If you don't plug that information vacuum, Facebook, CB chatter, truck stop chatter, that's going to fill it, and next thing you've got a problem. So yeah, get ahead of it.
So that's it from us. Obviously, you can get in touch with us at any time. We can share this, the actual template or the slides that we went through as well, so that we can send it out to the membership, James, if they would like. For, I guess, immigration updates and the like, I send out almost a weekly. I try not to make it too often. Doesn't help that the government's constantly moving the goalposts, but we do send out a newsletter update with regards to immigration policy changes, but particularly those that will affect employers and their staff. So if something's happening in the refugee space, we might not send an update in that regard because it's not necessarily going to affect your workforce. But we do sometimes then send a summary of this is everything that's happened over the last 3 months, just so you're aware, and how it may or may not affect you in your day-to-day operations. So feel free to get in touch and we can add you to that newsletter email list. We get lots of positive feedback about it, so it must be helpful.
Yeah. Thanks, Nazim. And if I could just wrap up, in summary, Nazim, I think you said that the backbone of all this is the accreditation. We're coming up to the first renewal phase. I'm not sure if any one of you saw Erica Stanford, the new Minister of Immigration, on with Jack Tame on Q&A last week. She's very clear that there's going to be more robust due diligence done on employers to ensure that there is less exploitation that is affecting New Zealand's brand internationally. So do expect some sort of rigour from Immigration New Zealand on your information that you're providing. It will happen. It's happening already. And so, just to reiterate what Nazim said, even though you may not need to renew for 3, 4, 5 months, we highly encourage you to start now to get an order. As soon as Immigration New Zealand find one small thing, like, for example, your module's not being done, they'll use that as an opportunity to dig further. The last thing anybody wants is an audit. But, that's what they are after. They are chasing audits. So that's our message. Get prepared and try and avoid that. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Yeah, can 100% agree with that, Scott. And that's some of the feedback we've been having from Immigration New Zealand. What we have also asked the lead of the investigation team is that if they detect anything even closely related to our sector, to let us know, and they are doing that. So far, none of our members have been affected, which is great. But yeah, we all know that Murphy's Law will apply. But we will be putting this, providing the recording has worked, we will be putting this recording up on the website, because I know we did get some comms saying that other people would have liked to be in here, but they were too busy driving and that sort of stuff. So we will be putting this up. So yes, Scott and Nazim, thank you very much for this, and we have had. Yep, there's some people have put in already in the Q&A that they found it quite useful. So that's great.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Thanks, James. Thanks everybody, and see you again.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. See you.
Bye-bye.